What if I told you that to your brain, the devastating, like, soul-crushing pain of being dumped is actually functionally indistinguishable from spilling boiling water on your forearm?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd, right? But the neuroscience actually backs that up completely.
It's wild because, society has this tendency to treat romantic heartbreak like a punchline in a bad romantic comedy.
Oh, absolutely. Like, just eat some ice cream and get over it.
Exactly. We tell our friends to, download a dating app and move on. We treat it like this fleeting emotional inconvenience.
Right, but the reality is that the wound left behind by romantic rejection isn't just some poetic metaphor. It is a biological, neurochemical, and in some cases, a literal cardiological trauma.
Which is exactly why today we're taking a massive deep dive into the profound, deeply misunderstood, and honestly almost universally experienced phenomenon of heartbreak, unrequited love, and romantic rejection.
It's arguably the most universal human ailment, I mean, truly, and yet it's the one we are the least equipped to handle medically or psychologically.
We validate physical trauma instantly, right? Like, oh, you broke your legs, sit down.
Yeah, but we leave people to navigate this intense emotional landscape completely in the dark. It's a huge blind spot.
So to fix that, we've pulled together an incredible stack of sources to shine some light on this. We're looking at peer-reviewed psychological studies out of Italy, tracking how young adults process relationship dissolution.
Which is such a vulnerable age group for this, too.
Totally. We also have clinical guidance literature written specifically for school counselors, the people on the front lines dealing with heartbroken kids.
Plus the hard medical data from the American Heart Association.
Yes, the AHA data is mind-blowing. And we've got therapeutic frameworks from mental health experts on how to actually genuinely cope.
So the mission today is really to uncover the biological and clinical realities of why a broken heart hurts so much, and, more importantly, how to actually heal from it.
Right. And I want to address you, the listener, directly for a second. Because statistically speaking, you have either been through this, you are currently going through it, or, you're supporting someone who is in the thick of it.
I mean, we all know someone.
We really do. So we want this deep dive to validate those feelings with hard science and provide you a shortcut to being a better friend to yourself and, to others.
To set the stage for this, I actually want to describe the visual we are looking at in the studio right now.
Oh, yeah. Paint the picture for them, because this is cool.
So I've pulled up an interactive, glowing map of the human brain, and we are focusing on the neural pathways associated with addiction and pain.
And right next to it, you've got this classic beating anatomical heart model.
Exactly. Because over the next hour or so, we're going to see that the line between emotional trauma and physical trauma is incredibly thin.
Almost non-existent.
Right. In fact, under the right stressful conditions, that line completely evaporates.
Okay, before we can understand why the pain is so intense, we need to accurately label what it is we are actually feeling when relationships fail.
Or, when they never even start in the first place, but we feel completely destroyed anyway.
Yeah, that happens a lot. The sources draw a very sharp line between normal infatuation, actual grounded love, and a concept called limerence.
Limerence. It's a term you are going to hear much more often in therapeutic circles moving forward.
Where did it even come from?
The psychologist Dorothy Tenoff actually coined it back in the late 70s, but it's having a major resurgence in clinical discussions today.
So why does it matter so much? Like, what's the difference?
It is vital to differentiate limerence from love, because the mechanism for recovering from a limerent attachment is, well, it's entirely different from grieving a reciprocal relationship that lasted for years.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think a lot of people assume that if they are obsessively thinking about someone, that must mean they are deeply in love.
Right, that's the common misconception.
How does limerence differ from just having a really intense, maybe slightly dramatic crush?
At its core, limerence is a state of involuntary, intense romantic desire and emotional obsession.
Okay.
But the defining characteristic, the thing that really separates it from love, is that it is driven entirely by fantasy rather than reality.
Ah, fantasy.
Yeah. When you are in a limerent state, you fixate on a person, and psychologists actually refer to this person as the limerent object, or the LO.
The limerent object? That sounds so clinical.
It does, but it's accurate. This individual becomes the absolute center of your psychological universe. You construct these incredibly elaborate fantasies about them.
You're basically making up who they are in your head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You experience extreme longing for reciprocation, and your emotional baseline becomes completely dangerously dependent on their actions or, their inactions.
So it's not a grounded feeling of like, I care about this person and want the best for them. It's more of an emotional roller coaster where they basically hold the remote control to your nervous system.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The hallmark of limerence is extreme emotional volatility.
Give me an example of what that looks like day to day.
Okay, so if the limerent object gives you a microscopic crumb of positive attention, say they view your social media story or they send a vague text or just make eye contact across a room.
The brain goes crazy.
Right, your brain floods with dopamine and you experience absolute euphoria.
But then what goes up must come down, right?
Brutally. If they don't respond for 6 hours or if their tone seems slightly distant, you don't just feel disappointed. You crash into profound despair or outright panic.
Your entire mood is just completely tethered to their perceived level of interest.
100%.
The clinical literature mentions that the limerent mind becomes a hypervigilant detective, which I find fascinating.
Oh, it really does. You end up interpreting the smallest interactions with this massive, exaggerated emotional weight.
Like analyzing the specific punctuation in a text message to prove they are secretly in love with you. They used a period, they must hate me.
Yes. The brain is looking for confirmation bias. It desperately wants the fantasy to be true, so it actively hunts for any proof that the feelings are reciprocated.
While ignoring the obvious.
Exactly. It simultaneously filters out massive red flags or, clear, obvious signs of disinterest.
But wait, doesn't early-stage romantic love feel pretty obsessive too? I mean, when you first start dating someone you really like, you're constantly checking your phone, you're analyzing their behavior.
That's true.
Where is the line between the honeymoon phase and this dangerous limerence thing?
Early-stage romantic love and limerence do share similar neurobiological footprints initially. The infatuation phase is biologically designed to be intense to promote bonding.
So the obsessiveness at the start is normal.
Yes, but healthy love evolves out of that phase. It grounds itself. Healthy love is built on shared values, mutual care, emotional reciprocity, and crucially, reality.
Reality, meaning you actually know them.
Right. You are interacting with the actual human being in front of you, flaws included. Limerence, conversely, thrives on emotional distance, uncertainty, and one-sidedness.
So it actually needs them to be far away.
It requires an element of the unattainable to survive.
Because if the person was actually available, you'd have to deal with the reality of them, which might ruin the perfect fantasy you've built.
Exactly the point. The fantasy is never confronted with the mundane, frustrating, day-to-day reality of a true relationship.
Which brings us to a really fascinating psychological concept from the sources regarding unrequited love or like shattered limerence.
Right. It functions as an ambiguous loss.
Ambiguous loss. I know that term is usually used in grief counseling for situations where there is no physical closure, like a missing person.
Yes, exactly.
How does it apply to a breakup?
Well, think about when a 20-year marriage ends. Society provides a framework for that grief. There are legal proceedings, division of assets, a clear transition.
Right, there's paperwork. The
Yeah.
loss is tangible.
But unrequited love, or the steady end of a very brief limerent attachment, is highly ambiguous. You aren't just grieving the physical absence of a person.
What are you grieving then?
You are grieving the potential future you constructed in your own mind. You are mourning a reality that never actually existed outside of your own imagination.
Wow. You're grieving a ghost.
You are.
And what makes it so difficult is that nobody else can see the ghost. Like if you're devastated over someone you only dated for 3 weeks, your friends might say, "Why are you so upset? You barely knew them."
Which is incredibly isolating. Society doesn't validate the grief of an unrealized future.
So you are just left alone with an immense amount of psychological distress that feels, to everyone else,
Yeah.
completely disproportionate to the actual events.
That's exactly why it hurts so much.
There's a literary parallel mentioned in our sources that I think illustrates the sheer destructiveness of this unrequited longing perfectly.
Oh, the Frankenstein reference.
Yes. It comes from an English teacher's perspective on exploring themes of attachment in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
It is a phenomenal lens through which to view attachment trauma, honestly.
So Victor Frankenstein creates this creature and immediately abandons it.
Right. Immediate rejection.
And the creature's entire character arc, his descent into anger, violence, and ultimate despair, stems directly from his unrequited desire for a base-level human connection.
He's just looking for a secure attachment.
Exactly. He looks at his creator, Victor, and he is desperate for love, for care, for basic validation of his existence. But Victor is horrified by him and rejects him entirely.
And that rejection is the catalyst.
Right. The creature doesn't turn into a monster because he was genetically predisposed to evil. His monstrous behavior is a direct reaction to the absolute void of love and the pain of ultimate rejection by the very source he expected it from.
It is a tragic metaphor for primal human attachment. The creature represents that deep biological craving we all have for connection.
It's built into us.
It is, and when that is denied, particularly by someone we have elevated to a position of immense importance, like a parent, or in our discussion, a limerent object, the psychological distress can be completely disorganizing.
The disconnect between the need for love and the reality of rejection creates trauma.
Precisely.
So if we pull this back to modern romance and limerence, I'm trying to think of a way to conceptualize this. Is it fair to say that being in limerence is kind of like watching a highly edited 2-minute movie trailer?
I like where you're going with this.
Like, it features incredible music, beautiful cinematography, and dramatic lighting. And you watch that trailer and convince yourself that the 2-hour movie is going to be an absolute masterpiece.
And you become obsessed with the trailer. You watch it over and over. Your brain takes those highly curated, perfect 2 minutes and fills in the remaining hour and 58 minutes with your own idealized narrative.
But if you actually sat down in the theater and watched the full movie, the dialogue might be clunky, the plot might be boring, or, it might be a genre you actually hate.
Or the screen might just be blank.
Oh, wow.
Because you only ever have access to the trailer. Because the limerent object remains emotionally unavailable, distant, or inconsistent, your mind never has to process the messy, boring, frustrating reality of the actual movie.
The fantasy remains pristine and untouchable.
Right. You become addicted to the potential of the relationship rather than the reality of the person.
That raises a huge question for anyone listening who might be in the thick of a new relationship right now. How do we know if we are building a foundation for real love or if we are just addicted to the trailer?
The clearest metric is safety versus anxiety.
Okay, break that down.
Ask yourself, does this connection make your nervous system feel secure, grounded, and calm? Or does it make you feel constantly anxious, hypervigilant, and off balance?
Real love fosters security.
Yes, real love feels safe. Limerence fosters a constant state of impending panic. Ask yourself if you are interacting with the actual flawed human being sitting across from you, or are you interacting with a highly curated version of them that lives entirely in your head?
I imagine it takes immense self-honesty to admit when we are stuck in that loop.
It's one of the hardest things to admit to yourself.
Okay, so if we establish that our minds are dealing with a shattered fantasy or this ambiguous loss, that certainly explains the mental confusion and the obsessive thoughts. Right.
It explains the cognitive side, yes.
We are mourning a future that evaporated.
Yeah.
But that doesn't explain the physical sensation.
Right.
I mean, when I went through a severe breakup in my 20s, it didn't just feel like a mental puzzle I couldn't solve. I literally felt like my chest was caved in.
It's visceral.
My joints ached. I was nauseous. I felt physically ill. Why does a broken heart cause actual physical agony?
This is where we transition from the psychology of attachment into the hard neurobiology of rejection. And for anyone currently hurting, this might be the most validating part of our entire discussion.
I really hope so.
The pain you are feeling is not a poetic metaphor. It is a documented biological reality.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I need to hear the mechanics of this because it feels like your body is turning against you.
Our sources point to groundbreaking research in social neuroscience, specifically utilizing functional MRI brain imaging.
So they were looking at live brains in real time.
Yes. Researchers took individuals who had recently experienced a highly undesired romantic breakup, so people who were still deeply in the throes of heartbreak.
And what did they do to them?
They put them in an MRI machine and had them perform 2 distinct tasks. First, a social rejection task, which involved looking at a photograph of their ex-partner and thinking about the rejection.
Ouch, that sounds awful.
It is. Then second, a physical pain task, which involved experiencing a highly uncomfortable near-burning sensation of heat applied to their left forearm.
So they were directly comparing the brain's reaction to emotional trauma versus literal physical tissue damage.
Exactly.
What did the scans show?
The scans revealed a profound overlap. The social rejection task activated the anterior cingulate cortex as well as the anterior insula.
Wait, those are the pain centers?
Yes, these are the exact same somatosensory regions of the brain that process the sensory components of physical pain.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that. The brain literally doesn't know the difference between being gumped and touching a hot stove.
Functionally, in terms of the neural circuitry lighting up, the brain processes the trauma using the exact same hardware.
That is wild.
The subjective experience of the pain is routed through the same distress centers. So when a patient sits in a therapist's office and says, "I am in agonizing pain over this breakup," they are not exaggerating.
They are providing an accurate medical description of their neurological state.
Yeah, exactly.
That absolutely reframes the entire experience. I mean, it explains the physical exhaustion completely.
Your brain is fighting a severe injury.
But what about the behavioral side? The obsessive craving, the feeling that you would do anything, just embarrass yourself entirely, just to get a text back from them.
That phenomenon brings us to the reward withdrawal effect. To understand the end of a relationship, we have to look at the beginning.
Okay, take me back to the honeymoon phase.
When you are intensely attracted to someone, your brain is absolutely flooded with a specific cocktail of neurotransmitters. You have dopamine, which drives reward, motivation, and craving.
The feel-good chemical.
Right. You have oxytocin, which facilitates deep bonding and trust. And you have elevated levels of norepinephrine, which gives you that energized, hyper-focused feeling.
So it's basically the neurochemical definition of the honeymoon phase. You feel invincible.
You feel invincible because you are essentially heavily medicated by your own biology.
Wow.
And your brain adapts to this influx of chemicals. It begins to rely on the presence of that specific person to trigger the reward center. The partner becomes the stimulus for the high.
So what happens when they leave?
When the relationship ends abruptly or when the unrequited feelings are definitively rejected, that external supply of dopamine and oxytocin is suddenly and violently cut off.
So the brain is suddenly starving for the chemicals it adapted to.
Exactly. The brain undergoes a state of neurochemical withdrawal that mimics the withdrawal experienced by individuals recovering from substance use disorders.
That is terrifying.
The dopamine plummets, creating feelings of lethargy and anhedonia, which is the inability to feel pleasure. Simultaneously, to cope with the stress of the loss, the body initiates a massive stress response, flooding the system with cortisol.
So you are dealing with drug withdrawal and a systemic panic attack at the exact same time.
Yes.
Yeah.
The elevated cortisol disrupts your circadian rhythm, which is why your sleep becomes fragmented and you wake up with a racing heart at 3 a.m.
That explains the 3 a.m. doom spiral.
Right. It also suppresses your digestive system, leading to the sudden loss of appetite or nausea. Your entire physiological baseline is thrown into a state of profound disorganization.
There is a specific data point in our sources from a study by Baumeister that really underscores how common this disorganization is.
Yes, the undergraduate study.
They studied a large cohort of undergraduate students and found that 93% reported experiencing at least one moderate or powerful experience of unrequited love.
93% is a staggering figure. It suggests that experiencing this neurobiological trauma is nearly a universal rite of passage for the human brain.
I want to push back on that number just a bit, though, because 93% seems almost impossibly high.
That's a fair point to raise.
Are they counting like a fleeting middle school crush where you got sad for an afternoon, or are we talking about actual devastating, life-altering heartbreak?
It's a valid critique of self-reported data. The study encompassed a spectrum, from intense crushes to profound limerent attachments. However, what is arguably more revealing than the 93% figure is the frequency.
What's the frequency?
The participants reported an average of 6.660 experiences with unrequited attraction within just a 5-year period.
Over 6 times in 5 years. That means the brain is constantly putting itself on the line, constantly risking this massive neurobiological withdrawal. Which leads me to a massive question.
Go ahead.
Why would human biology evolve this way? I mean, if the ultimate goal of evolution is survival, why would our biology make social rejection hurt as much as a physical injury? It seems like a massive design flaw that could incapacitate us.
It looks like a flaw when you view it through the lens of modern society where you can, order groceries on your phone and live completely isolated in an apartment.
Right. We don't technically need people to survive today.
But to understand the brain, we have to look at the environment it evolved in. If we zoom out to our hunter-gatherer ancestors living on the savannah, social connection wasn't a luxury. It was literal biological survival.
Because you couldn't survive alone.
You couldn't hunt alone, you couldn't defend against predators alone, you couldn't raise offspring alone. If you were rejected by your tribe, if you were ostracized or left behind, you didn't just feel lonely, you died.
Oh, social isolation was a death sentence.
Precisely. Just as physical pain evolved to tell you, take your hand out of the fire so you don't destroy your tissue, emotional pain evolved to scream, you are being separated from your social bonds, fix this immediately, or you will not survive the night.
The brain utilizes the physical pain circuitry to ensure you take the threat of social isolation seriously.
It is an evolutionary mandate to maintain attachment.
Wow. Okay, so if heartbreak is essentially a neurobiological drug withdrawal, and our ancient brain is sounding a life or death survival alarm to force us to reconnect,
Yes.
then the modern habit of stalking and excess social media isn't just a bad habit. It is fundamentally a drug relapse.
It is the clinical definition of a relapse.
That makes so much sense.
When you are in the agony of withdrawal, your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, is screaming that you are in mortal danger. Your brain knows that the ex-partner is the source of the dopamine that can stop the pain.
So you reach for the phone.
So you open Instagram, you look at their story, and for a fraction of a second, seeing their face delivers a microscopic hit of dopamine to the reward center. The craving is temporarily, momentarily soothed.
But then the rational brain catches up. You realize they're at a restaurant with someone else, or you remember that they don't want you anymore.
Right. The reality of the ambiguous loss sets back in. The tiny spike of dopamine crashes instantly, the cortisol floods the system even harder than before, and the withdrawal symptoms amplify.
You're trying to self-medicate the pain of the addiction, using the exact substance that caused the dependency in the first place.
It is a brutal maladaptive cycle.
Framing it that way offers an immense amount of grace to anyone going through this. You aren't pathetic, weak, or crazy for wanting to text them at 2 in the morning.
Not at all.
Your brain is literally experiencing a survival-level neurochemical emergency.
It removes the moral failing from the equation completely. Your biology is acting exactly as it was designed to act under the threat of separation.
The brain's stress response to this separation is clearly incredibly powerful. But our medical sources from the American Heart Association take this mind-body connection to a level that honestly terrified me when I read it.
You're talking about Takotsubo.
Yes, we've talked about the brain simulating physical pain, but the data shows that this emotional stress can actually visibly and temporarily deform the human heart.
This is the critical juncture where the subjective, invisible pain of a broken heart becomes a highly visible clinical cardiological emergency. It's known as broken heart syndrome, or medically as Takotsubo cardiomyopathy.
I always assumed broken heart syndrome was just a poetic term,
Yeah.
like used in Victorian novels when someone died of grief.
A lot of people think that.
But the AHA data proves this is a real, documented medical condition. What exactly happens in the body during an episode of Takotsubo?
Takotsubo cardiomyopathy is a sudden, acute, and temporary weakening of the muscular portion of the heart. It is directly triggered by an extreme emotional or physical stressor.
What qualifies as an extreme stressor in these cases?
The classic triggers are catastrophic emotional events. The sudden, unexpected death of a spouse, a devastating divorce, a massive romantic betrayal, or intense breakup.
Does it always have to be negative?
Interestingly, the literature notes it can also be triggered by a sudden, overwhelming positive shock, like winning the lottery or walking into a massive surprise party, although negative emotional trauma is far more common.
So the brain registers this massive emotional shock. The amygdala sounds the alarm, and the body dumps stress hormones. How does that translate to the heart actually failing? Like, what does the patient actually experience in that moment?
The clinical presentation is the most alarming part because the symptoms perfectly mimic a massive traditional myocardial infarction, a heart attack.
They feel like they're having a heart attack.
The patient experiences sudden crushing angina, which is severe chest pain. They have profound, sudden shortness of breath. They may develop arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats.
That's terrifying.
In severe cases, they can go into cardiogenic shock, where the suddenly weakened heart muscles simply cannot pump enough oxygenated blood to sustain the body's organs.
At that point, they're rushed to the emergency room, the trauma team takes over, they run the standard cardiac tests. What do the doctors find that distinguishes this from a normal heart attack?
Initially, the tests might look identical. They will run an EKG, and the electrical rhythm of the heart will often show abnormalities typical of a heart attack. Cardiac enzyme blood tests will show elevated levels, indicating stress on the heart muscle.
So everyone thinks it's a blocked artery.
Exactly. But the definitive difference is found when the cardiologist performed a coronary angiogram. That's when they thread a catheter in to look inside the arteries.
Because in a traditional heart attack, the angiogram shows a physical blockage, right? A buildup of plaque or a blood clot that has completely starved a section of the heart muscle of oxygen, causing that tissue to die.
Correct. But in a patient with Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, the angiogram reveals clear, unblocked coronary arteries.
So there's no blockage.
There is no physical obstruction starving the heart. Instead, the intense, sudden surge of catecholamines, stress hormones like adrenaline and noradrenaline, essentially poisons and stuns the heart muscle tissue.
It stuns it.
Yes, specifically it targets the lower left chamber of the heart, the left ventricle.
Stuns it how? What happens to the chamber?
The surge of stress hormones causes the muscle fibers of the left ventricle to suddenly balloon outward and essentially freeze. It stops contracting properly.
And that specific ballooning shape is where the name of the syndrome comes from, right?
Yes. The condition was first identified and described by Japanese researchers in the early 1990s. When they looked at the imaging of the heart during an episode, they noticed that the deformed, ballooning left ventricle looked exactly like a takotsubo.
Which is what?
A takotsubo is a traditional Japanese fishing pot used to trap octopuses. It has a narrow, constricted neck and a wide, rounded, balloon-like base.
It is a wildly vivid medical image. Under the sheer weight of emotional trauma, the human heart literally changes shape into an octopus trap.
It is a stunning visual representation of emotional weight. Now, while that left ventricle is paralyzed and ballooning, the rest of the heart muscle is functioning normally, or in some cases contracting even more violently to try and compensate for the failing ventricle.
So it's completely out of sync.
Right. This chaotic mismatch in pumping action creates severe short-term heart failure.
If the heart is failing to pump, this has to be incredibly dangerous. Can a person actually die from a broken heart?
It can be fatal in rare instances. If the patient goes into profound cardiogenic shock, it is an absolute medical emergency.
But mostly they recover.
Yes, the prognosis is generally very positive. Because the heart muscle isn't physically dying from a lack of oxygen, like in a traditional heart attack, it is merely stunned by hormones. Most patients make a full, complete recovery within a few days to a few weeks as the hormones flush out of their system.
That's a relief.
Furthermore, once they recover, the structural function of the heart returns to baseline, and they are at a remarkably low risk of the syndrome ever recurring.
The American Heart Association data specifically highlights a massive demographic disparity with this condition. Women are significantly more likely to experience takotsubo than men.
Yes, that is a well-documented finding.
Do the researchers understand the mechanism behind that?
The exact biological mechanism is still under intense study, but the prevailing theory revolves around how estrogen and other female hormones interact with the cardiovascular system and the brain's stress response.
Does estrogen protect the heart?
Estrogen generally exerts a protective effect on the heart and blood vessels. Post-menopause, when estrogen levels drop significantly, the heart muscle may become much more vulnerable to sudden, massive surges of catecholamines.
That explains the demographic perfectly.
Right. This aligns with the data showing that a large percentage of takotsubo cases occur in postmenopausal women.
The takeaway here for the listener is vital. If you or a friend are going through a devastating breakup, or you just received terrible emotional news, and you suddenly feel severe, crushing chest pain, you cannot afford to write it off as just a panic attack or being dramatic.
Absolutely not. You must treat it as a medical emergency and call 911 immediately.
Better safe than sorry.
Because the symptoms of takotsubo are completely indistinguishable from a fatal heart attack without sophisticated hospital imaging, you cannot take the risk.
Right.
The mind-body connection we are discussing is not an abstract philosophical concept. It is a physiological event happening in real time. The emotional pain is capable of manifesting as a critical cardiac event.
So if the physical heart survives the initial traumatic impact of the breakup, like if the left ventricle doesn't balloon, or if it does, it eventually recovers, we then move into the long-term phase.
The psychological aftermath.
Right. And the long-term damage of romantic rejection is almost entirely determined by how our minds process the aftermath. If the physical heart recovers, why do some people bounce back in a month while others remain completely derailed a year later? What is happening in the mind to prolong the pain?
That transition from the acute physical shock to the prolonged psychological aftermath is where the true battle is fought. The initial rejection is the trauma. The subsequent weeks and months are where the cognitive spiral either unwinds toward healing or tightens into a knot of prolonged distress.
To understand this spiral, our sources provided an incredibly detailed, massive, peer-reviewed study published in Frontiers in Psychiatry by Mancone and colleagues out of Italy.
Yes, the Italian study.
They tracked 560 adolescents and young adults, ages 17 to 22, who had recently experienced a romantic breakup.
It is a brilliant data set to analyze because this specific age demographic, late adolescence to early adulthood, is a highly volatile developmental window.
There's so much going on in your life at that age.
Exactly. It is a period of intense identity formation, the ongoing development of emotional regulation skills, and a massive shift in attachment away from primary caregivers toward peer groups and romantic partners.
So a breakup hits them incredibly hard.
Breakups during this phase hit with incredible force because romantic success is rapidly becoming a core component of their developing self-concept.
The Italian study focused heavily on analyzing two specific cognitive responses to the breakup: rumination and avoidance.
Yes, those two are key.
Let's break these down, starting with rumination. What is the clinical definition, and what did the study find about its real-world impact?
Rumination is clinically defined as the repetitive, passive, and intrusive focus on negative emotions and the distressing thoughts associated with a traumatic event.
So getting stuck on replay.
It is the mental loop that you cannot turn off. It's lying awake in bed at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, endlessly asking unanswerable questions like, why did this happen? What exactly did I do wrong? What are they doing right now with someone else?
It's treating the memory of the breakup conversation like a crime scene, replaying it over and over, looking for a clue that might change the outcome.
Yes, and the brain believes that by replaying it, it might solve the problem. But it doesn't.
It just drains you.
The Italian study found that this specific behavior, rumination, is a massive, reliable predictor of severe negative outcomes across the board. Individuals who scored high in rumination showed statistically significant negative impacts on both their academic performance and their physical health metrics.
So it isn't just making them sad.
Yeah.
It is actively degrading their ability to function. Their grades are actually dropping.
Because rumination acts as an immense cognitive drain. Your working memory and your executive functioning, the parts of your brain required to learn, focus, and solve complex problems, have limited bandwidth.
You only have so much energy.
If 80% of that bandwidth is entirely occupied by the traumatic replay of the breakup, you simply do not have the cognitive resources left to concentrate on a university lecture, synthesize information for an essay, or perform well at a job.
Makes total sense.
Furthermore, the constant mental replay keeps the body trapped in that elevated cortisol stress response we discussed, which severely disrupts sleep architecture and suppresses immune function, leading to the physical health impacts the researchers recorded.
Rumination is clearly a destructive loop. But then the study looked at the second cognitive response, avoidance strategies. And I have to admit, I am genuinely confused by how they frame this.
How so?
Well, earlier we talked about how checking an ex's social media is a neurochemical relapse, and we need to cut off contact. Now, this study seems to suggest avoidance is a bad thing. How do we draw the line? Isn't avoiding your ex exactly what you're supposed to do?
It is a fantastic question, and it highlights a critical distinction that trips up a lot of people in therapy. There is a profound, fundamental difference between healthy boundary setting and maladaptive emotional avoidance.
Walk me through the difference, because they sound very similar on the surface.
Setting a boundary, for example, deciding to block their phone number, unfollowing them on Instagram, or avoiding the coffee shop you know they frequent is an active, strategic, and conscious decision made to protect your nervous system.
So you're doing it on purpose.
You are doing this to create a safe container while you intentionally process your grief. You are fully acknowledging the pain, but you are intelligently removing the external triggers that exacerbate it.
Okay, that makes sense. So what is maladaptive avoidance?
Maladaptive emotional avoidance, on the other hand, is an internal attempt to suppress the emotion entirely. It is a state of deep denial. It's a refusal to acknowledge that the pain even exists.
I see.
A person using maladaptive avoidance will fill every waking second of their day with noise or frantic distraction, working 80 hours a week, binge drinking, constantly surrounding themselves with people, specifically so they do not have a single moment of silence where they might have to actually feel the grief of the loss.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Boundary setting is giving yourself a quiet room to cry in. Avoidance is turning the music up so loud you can't hear yourself crying.
That's an excellent way to conceptualize it. And this leads us to the core, arguably most important finding of the Italian study regarding how the mind gets stuck. They discovered that avoidance actually mediates the relationship between rumination and emotional distress.
In practical terms, what does mediates mean in this context?
It means that rumination and avoidance are not separate strategies. They actively feed into each other to create a destructive cycle known in psychology as the cognitive avoidance model.
How does the cycle work?
Here is how it works. A person begins to ruminate on the breakup. This rumination generates intense, overwhelming psychological distress. Because that distress feels utterly unbearable, the brain seeks an immediate escape hatch, and it utilizes avoidance to numb out. They push the thoughts away through frantic distraction or suppression.
But the escape hatch doesn't lead to healing. It just pauses the pain.
Precisely. The relief is entirely temporary. Because they utilized avoidance, they delayed the actual emotional processing of the grief. The brain hasn't resolved the trauma. Consequently, the unresolved, suppressed emotions eventually bubble back up to the surface.
Which starts the whole thing over again.
This triggers more rumination, which generates more unbearable pain, which forces the brain back into more avoidance. It creates an maladaptive feedback loop that can extend the acute psychological pain of a breakup for months or even years.
By frantically trying to run away from the pain, they are effectively building the prison that traps them inside it. That is deeply tragic. The study also dug into demographic differences, specifically regarding gender. What did the data show there?
The researchers found distinct patterns in how young men and women navigated the aftermath. The women in the study reported significantly higher levels of rumination than the men.
Did they avoid things too?
They were also slightly more likely to engage in those maladaptive avoidance strategies we just discussed, and statistically more likely to turn to religion or spiritual practices as a coping mechanism. However, the data also showed a massive protective factor.
What was it?
The women sought out and actively received significantly more social support from their peer networks than the men did.
Why do these gender differences exist? Is it biological wiring, or is it how we socialize young adults to handle emotions?
It is heavily influenced by sociological conditioning, interwoven with some neurobiological factors regarding emotional reactivity. Broadly speaking, women in many societies are socialized to be more emotionally expressive and relationship-focused, which can lead to higher emotional reactivity and cognitive preoccupation, hence the higher rumination scores.
But that same socialization gives them a safety net.
Exactly. That socialization encourages them to lean on their community when they are hurting. Men, conversely, are often conditioned to mask vulnerability. They might score lower on conscious rumination because they are suppressing it entirely, and they tend to isolate rather than leverage social support, which can make their long-term recovery much more brittle.
The study also touched on how a person's psychological background, things like rejection sensitivity and attachment styles, dictates their reaction to a breakup.
Yes. Your baseline attachment style, which is often forged in early childhood based on the consistency of care you received from your primary caregivers, dictates how you interpret romantic loss.
So, like anxious versus avoidance styles.
Yeah, if you developed an anxious attachment style, your sense of self-worth is often heavily contingent on the presence and approval of a romantic partner. When that relationship ends, you don't just process it as the loss of a companion. Your brain processes it as a fundamental rejection of your core value as a human being.
Which makes it so much harder to recover from.
The grief is exponentially magnified because you are highly sensitive to rejection, making it incredibly difficult to break the rumination loop.
Because this psychological spiral of rumination and avoidance can be so severe, and because it can demonstrably destroy someone's academic performance and physical health, we have to talk about the tipping point.
Yes, this is crucial.
When does a normal, albeit agonizing broken heart, cross the line into a clinical mental health crisis that requires professional intervention?
Identifying that tipping point is vital for clinicians, educators, parents, and friends. Heartbreak is universal, but clinical depression is a distinct, life-threatening condition.
From the outside, they look remarkably similar, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, if my friend is going through a breakup, they are crying constantly, they don't want to leave their apartment, they've lost their appetite. Those are all symptoms of depression. How do we distinguish between the two?
They share a massive overlap in symptom presentation, which is why it can be confusing. The Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, the DSM-5-TR, explicitly acknowledges this overlap when discussing adjustment disorders and major depressive episodes following a significant loss. However, clinicians look for key differences in scope and duration.
Scope and duration, explain that.
Normal heartbreak, even severe heartbreak, is characterized by grief that remains tethered specifically to the loss of that person or the relationship. The emotional pain is intense, but the mood fluctuates. You might spend the entire morning crying over a photograph, but by the evening, if a friend comes over, you are capable of laughing at a joke or briefly enjoying a good meal.
And what about your self-esteem?
Furthermore, your global self-esteem remains generally intact. You might feel rejected by your ex-partner, but you don't fundamentally believe you are a worthless human being.
So with normal heartbreak, the pain comes in massive waves, but there are distinct breaks in the clouds where your normal personality peeks through.
Exactly. Major depressive disorder, however, operates differently. It is pervasive, global, and unrelenting. It acts like a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over the entire brain.
It affects everything.
The loss of interest extends to all activities, not just the ones associated with the ex-partner. There is a persistent neurological inability to experience pleasure, anhedonia, and most critically, clinical depression often involves global, systemic feelings of worthlessness and intense guilt.
The narrative changes.
The thought isn't, they didn't want me. The thought mutates into, I am fundamentally broken, toxic, and permanently unlovable by anyone. If that pervasive global state lasts constantly for more than 2 weeks, a clinician is looking at a major depressive episode.
Our sources include a deeply insightful clinical paper authored by Dameron and Curtis, written specifically for school counselors. And one data point stood out to me. They note that relationship issues and romantic breakups are actually the most common reason adolescents seek out school counseling services.
Which is a staggering statistic when you pause to consider the immense pressures modern teenagers face. Intense academic competition, complex family dynamics, social media bullying, identity struggles.
But a breakup is the final straw.
Yet the dissolution of a romantic relationship is the primary catalyst that drives them to seek clinical help. The neurological withdrawal we discussed earlier is hitting a brain that hasn't fully developed its executive functioning and emotional regulation hardware. Breakups can trigger severe adjustment disorders, or they can act as the stressor that unmasks a latent depressive disorder that was already simmering below the surface.
The paper provides 2 really powerful clinical case studies that brilliantly illustrate this tipping point in real time. I want to walk through both of them. Let's look at the first one. Carly, she's a middle school student.
Yes. Carly experienced a breakup, she was dumped by her boyfriend Jamal, and the immediate observable impact was that her academic performance completely tanked. She became highly withdrawn in class.
And the English class was the worst part for her.
Right. But the distress was incredibly acute in her English class, specifically because the teacher utilized a small group learning structure, and Carly was forced to sit and work directly with Jamal every single day.
Which sounds like absolute psychological torture, having to collaborate on an English project with the middle school boy who just broke your heart while you were experiencing neurochemical withdrawal.
It is a perfect recipe for severe distress and academic failure. The English teacher observed that Carly had stopped turning in homework entirely and was completely disengaged.
Right.
Recognizing the emotional component, the teacher consulted the school counselor.
How did the counselor intervene? What was the practical step?
The intervention was twofold. First, they implemented an immediate structural change. The teacher discreetly rearranged the learning groups so Carly no longer had to interact with Jamal.
So, basic boundary setting.
That is the healthy boundary setting we discussed, intelligently removing the immediate trigger to calm the nervous system. Following that, the counselor brought Carly in for a session.
Did they assess her for depression?
They performed an assessment and determined she was not exhibiting the pervasive warning signs for severe clinical depression or self-harm, but she was deeply stuck in the rumination loop regarding the loss.
How did they break the loop?
To break that loop, the counselor utilized a specific, targeted therapeutic tool, a future relationship narrative writing activity.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. What exactly did she have to write?
The counselor instructed Carly to write down, in detail, what she might be looking for in her next relationship whenever she was ready for one. She was asked to describe the character traits she hopes that future person will possess, how they might treat her, and the types of activities they might enjoy doing together.
Why does a writing exercise like that work? It seems almost too simple.
It works because of neuroplasticity. When Carly is ruminating, her brain is entirely focused backward, pouring all its energy into analyzing the loss of the limerent object, Jamal. The writing activity forces the brain to shift gears out of the retrospective rumination loop and begin constructing a forward-looking, future-oriented narrative. It actively instills hope.
It gives her brain something else to focus on.
More importantly, it validates that her desire for romantic connection is healthy and normal, while gently but firmly decoupling that desire from the specific person of Jamal. It trains the brain to realize that the source of potential dopamine and connection is not restricted to the person who rejected her.
Did it work for her?
After 4 targeted sessions utilizing this reframing, Carly's grades stabilized, and she was able to accept the end of the relationship.
That is a phenomenal example of a targeted, short-term intervention preventing a downward spiral. But the second case study provided in the literature is much heavier. It deals with a high school student named Samir.
Yes, Samir's situation illustrates a scenario that actively crossed that clinical tipping point. Samir was dumped by his first boyfriend after a 6-month relationship.
How did it happen?
The rejection was particularly brutal because it was done via a brief text message, simply stating that the boyfriend wasn't in love with Samir anymore.
A completely unilateral rejection, delivered in the most disconnected way possible.
Samir's mother began noticing severe behavioral changes. He wasn't just exhibiting typical sadness, he was highly aggressively irritable. He snapped and yelled at his 4-year-old sister, which his mother noted was completely out of character for him.
Irritability isn't always what people think of with depression.
Irritability is a major yet frequently overlooked primary symptom of clinical depression in adolescents, particularly in young men who may be socialized to express sadness as anger.
And the situation escalated quickly after that.
It did. The mother was monitoring his social media and found a highly concerning post on Samir's Facebook page. He wrote, "Nothing makes sense anymore, I'm out."
I'm out. That is a terrifying phrase for any parent or friend to read.
Absolutely. The mother immediately contacted the school counselor. Because of the ambiguous but highly suggestive phrasing of "I'm out," the counselor recognized the immediate risk and had to perform a direct, structured suicide risk assessment.
What does a direct suicide risk assessment actually entail in a school setting?
It requires the clinician to ask direct, unambiguous questions. They systematically ask the student if they are experiencing thoughts of ending their life, if they have the intent to act on those thoughts, and critically, whether they have formulated a specific plan or have access to the lethal means to harm themselves.
What did Samir say?
In Samir's case, during the assessment, he explicitly stated that he did not have a plan to complete suicide. However, he reported a pervasive global loss of interest in all activities, constant fatigue, and a feeling of overwhelming hopelessness.
So his symptoms had moved beyond the localized waves of grief over the boyfriend and had settled into that global pervasive depression we discussed.
Exactly. The counselor correctly identified him as a low immediate risk for acute self-harm, but recognized that the underlying pervasive depression required specialized clinical intervention that exceeded the scope of a school counseling setting.
So they referred him out.
The counselor worked closely with the parents to provide an immediate referral to an outside clinical mental health professional for ongoing therapy.
If someone listening to this deep dive is currently hurting, and they are wondering if they or their friend need professional therapy, the experts make it clear that it is not a contest of who has it worse. You don't need to be in acute crisis to deserve help.
That's a very important message.
The key metric clinicians look at is impact. Is this emotional pain completely impairing your daily functioning? Can you physically get out of bed? Can you perform the basic duties of your job? Are you withdrawing from every single person who cares about you?
That is the crucial threshold. Emotional pain is an inevitable part of the human experience, but functional impairment is a giant, flashing neon sign that your nervous system is overwhelmed and you need a structured, professional intervention to help carry the load.
I think one of the biggest hurdles is the societal stigma around getting clinical help for a breakup. Society tells us to toughen up. You don't often hear someone call into HR and say, "I need to take a week of medical leave because my heart is broken."
No, you rarely hear that.
It sounds almost frivolous to some people, even though we just spent 20 minutes proving it's a profound physiological trauma.
Yeah.
How do we destigmatize this?
We destigmatize it through education. By having expansive, medically grounded conversations exactly like this one. When people understand that the brain processes romantic rejection utilizing the exact same neural pathways as a physical burn injury, and that the resulting hormonal cascade is capable of inducing major clinical depression or even causing the left ventricle of the heart to temporarily fail, the stigma evaporates.
It just becomes science.
Once you realize you are dealing with a verifiable neurobiological injury, seeking cognitive therapy makes as much logical sense as going to a physical therapist to rehabilitate a torn ACL.
So we've mapped out the minefield. We understand the clinical risks. We see the dangerous traps of rumination and avoidance, and we comprehend the brutal biology of the dopamine withdrawal. The ultimate question is, what are the scientifically backed, evidence-based ways to actually heal the injury? Let's open the toolkit.
The toolkit is robust, and we can start with the findings from that large Italian study of young adults. When analyzing coping mechanisms, they found that participants who actively utilized strategies categorized as positive attitude and problem solving predicted significantly better outcomes in both academic performance and family relationship stability.
I have to pause on the term positive attitude. In the context of devastating heartbreak, that sounds dangerously close to toxic positivity. Like telling someone whose life just fell apart to just smile through the pain and look on the bright side. Is that what the researchers mean?
Not at all. That's a common misinterpretation. In clinical psychology, utilizing a positive attitude strategy is not about pretending everything is fine or suppressing the negative emotion. It is synonymous with cognitive reframing.
Cognitive reframing. Tell me more about that.
It is the active, deliberate process of identifying and challenging the massive cognitive distortions that the rumination loop relies on to keep you trapped in despair.
Walk me through an example of cognitive reframing. How does changing a sentence in my head change the neurobiology of my pain?
Let's assume your partner unexpectedly leaves you. The automatic thought, the cognitive distortion generated by your distressed brain might be, I wasn't chosen because I am fundamentally unlovable. There is something inherently wrong with me, and I will be alone forever.
A very common thought in a breakup.
That thought acts as gasoline on the fire of your despair, spiking cortisol and reinforcing the neural pathways of depression. Cognitive reframing, which is a foundational mechanism of cognitive behavioral therapy, teaches you to treat that thought not as a fact, but as a hypothesis that needs to be tested against reality.
So you argue with yourself.
You actively challenge it with evidence. You intentionally reframe the narrative to, this specific relationship ended because of a fundamental compatibility issue. Their departure is a reflection of our mismatch and their current capacity, not a reflection of my inherent worth as a human being.
That is a massive neurological pivot. It takes the blame entirely off your core identity.
It does. It moves the brain from a state of catastrophic, total devastation to a state of manageable, localized disappointment. It requires massive effort, but it rewires the brain.
I'm picturing it like actual physical therapy for a severe injury. If you shatter your leg, you don't just lie in bed and hope the muscle spontaneously regenerates.
Yeah.
You have to go to the clinic and do specific, targeted, often deeply painful exercises to manually rebuild the muscle fibers. Reframing those destructive thoughts is the mental repetition required to rebuild the cognitive muscle.
That is the exact mechanism of neuroplasticity. You are literally firing different neurons together, forcing them to wire together, constructing new, healthier neural pathways while letting the old pathways of despair atrophy from disuse.
What's next in the toolkit?
Another highly effective tool highlighted by clinical sources comes from acceptance and commitment therapy, commonly known as ACT. Where CDT focuses on changing the thought, ACT focuses on changing your relationship to the thought.
How so?
It emphasizes allowing the grief to exist instead of fighting an exhausting war against it. We know from the cognitive avoidance model that frantically running from the pain only prolongs the trauma. ACT proposes a radical alternative. Sit with the pain, but put strict structural boundaries around it.
How do you practically implement that? How do you sit with the pain without letting it swallow you whole?
A highly effective practical technique is to intentionally schedule and contain the grief. You set a physical timer on your phone for 10 or 15 minutes a day. You designate this as your processing time.
And what do you do during that time?
During those 15 minutes, you get yourself absolute unfiltered permission to feel the absolute depths of the loss. You can cry openly, you can journal aggressively, you can look at old photos, you lean completely into the trauma.
And when the 15-minute timer goes off?
When the alarm sounds, the session is over. You close the journal, you wash your face, you take 3 deep breaths to reset your parasympathetic nervous system, and you consciously, actively shift your cognitive attention back to your present-day tasks.
You aren't suppressing the emotion, which we know is dangerous. You are scheduling it.
Precisely. You are giving the amygdala a highly controlled, safe environment to process the trauma without allowing the emotional hijack to ruin your entire day. It teaches your brain that you are capable of experiencing intense pain and surviving it, which builds massive emotional resilience.
That sounds incredibly empowering. You are taking executive control of the grief instead of letting the grief dictate your life. What else goes into this healing toolkit?
Creating healthy distance, which circles back to our earlier discussion on boundary setting. This is the strategic, non-negotiable reduction of triggers. You must mute or block their social media. You do not text them.
Cut off the supply entirely.
If you are forced to interact because you work together or co-parent children, you employ the gray rock method, keeping all interactions strictly transactional, brief, and devoid of emotional subtext. You have to aggressively starve the dopamine craving if you ever want the neurological withdrawal symptoms to cease.
You have to treat it like an addiction detox. You cannot heal in the same environment that is making you sick.
Yes. And the final, perhaps most crucial step in the toolkit is the active rebuilding of identity. When you are deeply in love or profoundly stuck in limerence, your neural pathways become enmeshed with the other person or the fantasy of them. They become heavily integrated into your concept of self.
So when they leave, a part of you is just gone.
When they are removed, you are left with a psychological void. You literally feel empty.
So how do you fill that void without just rushing into a rebound relationship, which is what so many people do?
You fill the void by setting a future-focused anchor that is entirely unrelated to dating or romantic validation. You force the brain to generate dopamine through alternative avenues. You take up a complex new hobby that requires intense focus. You commit to a rigorous fitness goal. You focus aggressively on a career milestone or volunteer work.
Doing hard things.
By engaging in these novel, challenging activities, you naturally boost your own dopamine and serotonin levels.
You are proving to your own nervous system that it is capable of generating reward, motivation, and joy completely independently of that specific person.
You are reclaiming your neurochemistry. Healing isn't about sitting around waiting for the pain to magically fade or forcing yourself to pretend you don't care. It is about actively regulating your nervous system. Time alone does not heal trauma. Active cognitive processing and the intentional creation of new sources of neurochemical reward is what actually heals you.
Time just passes. It's the physical therapy you do during that time that determines if the bone heals straight or crooked. Okay, so that is an incredibly robust toolkit for the person who is hurting. But human beings are social creatures. We don't heal in a vacuum. What if you aren't the one dealing with the broken heart? What if you are the friend, the roommate, the parent, or the sibling trying to support someone who is trapped in the rumination loop?
The role of the support system is paramount. The Italian study we analyzed specifically highlighted the profound protective role of perceived support quality.
Perceived support quality. So it's not just about having a bunch of friends around you. It's about the quality of how they are supporting you and whether you actually feel supported by their actions.
Exactly. Having 5 friends who constantly invalidate your feelings is worse than being alone. High-quality perceived support was shown to be a massive buffer against emotional distress. It actively helped the young adults in the study adopt those positive problem-solving strategies and break the avoidance loop.
So, drawing directly from our clinical sources, let's build a practical guide for the supporters. What are the definitive do's and don'ts of helping a broken-hearted person? What is the very first DO?
The primary DO is to educate yourself on the biology of what they are experiencing, which is exactly what everyone listening to this deep dive is doing right now. When you genuinely understand that your friend is going through a physiological drug withdrawal state and a massive cortisol spike, it grants you immense patience. You stop judging them for being repetitive.
Knowledge is empathy.
The next crucial DO is to offer an active, engaged listening ear without an ounce of judgment.
I have to admit, this is where I personally struggle the most. It is incredibly, agonizingly hard to watch someone you love suffer and not immediately try to fix the problem.
It's a very natural instinct to want to fix it.
It feels like watching someone struggle to put together a puzzle. And your instinct is to just grab the pieces out of their hands and jam them together for them. I just want to yell, block his number, download a dating app, let's go to a bar and forget about it.
And that frantic urge to fix it comes from a place of deep empathy and love because human beings are wired to distress when we see our tribe members in pain. We want to neutralize the threat. But jumping into fix-it mode or offering unsolicited advice is actually a major don't.
Wait, really? Yeah.
Because it inadvertently invalidates their current emotional reality. It subtly signals to them that their pain is a problem that needs to be quickly eradicated, rather than a valid emotion that needs to be processed.
Oh, that makes sense. You're accidentally telling them they shouldn't feel the way they feel.
Exactly. Active listening means overriding your own anxiety and simply sitting with someone inside their pain. It is the practice of saying, "This sounds incredibly painful, it is unfair, and I am so sorry you are carrying this. I am right here with you." Empathy validates their reality, and that validation literally, measurably calms their hyper-aroused amygdala.
If a listener is sitting with a friend who is actively spiraling, they are deep in the rumination loop, sobbing over a vague text message from their ex. What is the exact clinically supportive phrase to use in that moment?
The most regulating phrase you can offer is, "It makes complete sense that you feel this way right now. This is a massive loss. I am here for you, and we can just sit here together for as long as you need." No advice, no silver linings, just grounded presence.
It makes complete sense. You are validating the invisible wound. You are acknowledging the pain that doesn't show up on an x-ray.
Yeah.
What are the other major don'ts for supporters?
Don't assume you know the intricate realities of their relationship or dictate how quickly they should be moving through the stages of grief. Don't invalidate their profound neurobiological state with toxic positivity platitudes like, "Just cheer up," or "There are plenty of fish in the sea," or worst of all, "It's all in your head."
Because, as we have definitively established, it is not just in their head. It is lighting up their anterior cingulate cortex, spiking their cortisol, and potentially stunning the left ventricle of their heart.
Precisely. Another crucial, do not force them into clinical therapy with aggressive ultimatums, saying, "If you don't go see a therapist by Friday, I'm done hanging out with you," only creates more stress and triggers their rejection sensitivity.
So how do you encourage therapy without pushing them away?
Instead, gently and consistently encourage professional help. Offer tangible assistance. Offer to help them research therapists who take their insurance, or offer to drive them to their first appointment and sit in the waiting room so they don't have to go alone.
And what about the mental health of the person providing the support? Because let's be honest, listening to a friend ruminate about the same breakup conversation for 6 weeks straight can be deeply exhausting.
That leads to the final, absolutely vital, don't. Do not neglect your own mental health and boundaries. Caregiver burnout is a highly documented psychological phenomenon. You cannot pour from an empty cup. If you exhaust your own emotional reserves, you become resentful and useless to your friend.
How do you set a boundary without abandoning them?
It is highly encouraged to set loving, firm boundaries. You can say, "I love you deeply and I want to support you through this, but I only have the emotional bandwidth to talk about the breakup for 30 minutes tonight. After that, we need to order food and watch a movie or talk about something else."
Setting a boundary like that protects the longevity of the friendship and prevents the supporter from quietly pulling away out of exhaustion. It creates a sustainable ecosystem of support. This has been an absolutely massive paradigm-shifting journey today. We started by stripping away the romanticized myths of heartbreak to define the obsessive, fantasy-driven trap of limerence.
It's all about separating the fantasy from the reality.
We uncovered the literal physical reality of rejection, how the human brain processes the loss of social connection, utilizing the exact same neural circuitry as a physical burn injury. We explored the brutal reality of dopamine withdrawal and how extreme emotional stress can literally deform the human heart into an octopus trap in Takotsuka cardiomyopathy.
We charted the dangerous psychological aftermath, too. We saw how rumination drains our cognitive bandwidth and how trying to avoid the pain only creates a maladaptive feedback loop that traps us inside the trauma even longer.
We looked at the clinical tipping points, learning to distinguish the localized waves of normal grief from the pervasive global darkness of clinical depression, utilizing real case studies of adolescents navigating this precise trauma.
And we finally built the evidence-based toolkit.
Yes, we discussed the neuroplasticity of cognitive reframing to challenge destructive thoughts, the power of emotional containment using ACT, the necessity of starving the dopamine cravings through strategic boundaries, and the importance of rebuilding our identity independent of the loss. And finally, we learned how to be a true, grounded support system by validating the pain instead of frantically trying to fix it. I want to remind you, the listener, right now, if you are currently hurting, your pain is real. It is biologically validated by centuries of evolution. It is not traumatic, it is not pathetic, and you are not crazy. It is deeply, profoundly human. And feeling this level of pain is the ultimate proof of your absolute capacity for real, vibrant connection.
If we connect all of this hard science to the bigger picture of the human experience, heartache is simply the universal, non-negotiable cost of admission for love. You cannot experience the neurobiological highs of deep attachment without risking the agonizing lows of withdrawal. To avoid the pain entirely would mean living a life completely heavily armored and devoid of human connection. The pain you are feeling is the biological proof that you are fully alive.
That is a phenomenal, grounding way to reframe the entire experience. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own time. Something that builds on the evolutionary biology we discussed today. We established that our human brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to process social rejection exactly like physical pain. It is an ancient, hardwired alarm system designed to ensure our survival within a physical tribe. We are wired to feel acute agony so that we seek out reconnection. But if that is the fundamental truth of our neurobiology, how might the modern invention of social media be completely short-circuiting that ancient system? We have built a digital ecosystem where we can infinitely track the exact people who rejected us, where we have 247 high-definition access to the ghosts of our past relationships. Are we building technologies that actively, aggressively fight against our brain's natural evolutionary healing processes? Are we forcing ourselves to live in a state of permanent, low-grade neurochemical withdrawal? It makes you wonder, maybe the very first, most crucial step to healing that invisible wound isn't found in a medical textbook or therapy office. Maybe the first step is simply having the courage to finally, definitively put down the phone.